When I was 42, I thought my heart had already lived through every kind of storm. I had buried my husband 5 years earlier after a long fight with cancer, raised 2 teenage sons alone in a small town outside of Savannah, Georgia, and worked every hour God sent at the diner on Main Street just to keep the lights on. Love, at that point, was something I saw through the steam of coffee cups and the laughter of young couples in corner booths. It wasn't meant for me anymore. Or at least, that's what I told myself every night when I went home to an empty house that still smelled faintly of the man I'd lost. Then one day, he walked in, and from that moment on, nothing about my life or my heart would ever be the same again. His name was Eli Turner, and he was 21, just half my age, a college kid home for the summer. He came in wearing a sun-faded denim jacket, a sketchbook tucked under his arm, and a smile that could thaw the coldest morning. He sat at the counter, ordered black coffee, and looked at me. Not the way young men usually glance at older women, with polite distance or detached respect. His eyes lingered like he was reading something written deep inside me that no one else had ever stopped to see. "Rough morning?" he asked, after I'd spilled a little coffee on the counter. His voice was light, teasing, but gentle. I laughed it off, embarrassed. "Every morning's rough when you've been doing this for 20 years, he smiled. "Then you make it look easy." It had been a long time since anyone had said something that simple and made my chest tighten like that. He started coming in every day after that. Always the same stool, same order, same quiet smile. Sometimes he'd bring his sketchbook, sometimes he'd just talk. He was an art student, painting landscapes and portraits of small-town life. But what fascinated me most wasn't what he said, it was how he listened. He listened like every word mattered, like silence itself was sacred. I remember one rainy Thursday afternoon, the diner was empty, thunder rolling outside. Eli sat sketching by the window, and I asked, "You ever draw real people? Or just the pretty things?" He looked up at me, those clear blue eyes steady. "I think real people are the prettiest things," he said. "You, for example, you have the kind of face that's lived. That's what I want to learn to draw." I froze, my hand tightening around the coffee pot. I laughed again, awkwardly. "You don't need to flatter your waitress, sweetheart. I'm too old for that." He tilted his head, studying me like I was part of a painting. "You're not old," he said softly. "You're just ahead of me in the story." I didn't know it then, but that was the first moment I realized I was slipping, falling. Not fast, not in a rush of fireworks, but slowly, in the quiet rhythm of long looks and kind words that reached where grief had once lived. There was nothing inappropriate about it at first. He was polite, respectful, and kind, but something about the way he looked at me made me feel like I'd stepped out of the life I knew and into one I'd forgotten I could still have. By mid-July, he'd become part of my days the way the sound of the bell over the diner door was part of my mornings. We talked about everything, about the smell of rain on hot pavement, about dreams that faded before they had a chance to bloom. He told me his father had left when he was 10, that his mother worked herself to exhaustion just to keep him in school. I told him I understood that kind of tired, the kind that never leaves your bones. Somewhere in those shared aches, something quiet and dangerous began to grow. One evening, after closing time, I found him outside, sitting on the steps in the golden light of dusk. "You shouldn't still be here," I said, leaning on the doorframe. "I like this hour," he said, gazing out at the road. "Everything softens a little before it disappears." "Like people?" I asked. He turned to me then, and that look, the one that seemed to see right through every defense I had left, it caught me off guard. "Like you," he said simply. "You don't even realize how much light you still give off." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I just stood there, my heart thudding like it hadn't in years. I wanted to tell him to stop, to go live his young life, to love someone who wasn't worn down by years of loss, but I couldn't make the words come out. That night, for the first time since my husband died, I didn't dream about hospitals or grief. I dreamed about sunlight through a diner window, about laughter over cold coffee, and about blue eyes that saw me as more than the life I'd already lived. The next morning, when he came in, I poured his coffee without asking, and he smiled, that same gentle smile. "Morning, Claire," he said, the first time he'd ever used my name. And just like that, I felt something shift in the air between us, something fragile and terrifying and alive. I told myself it was just a friendship, just kindness between two lonely souls. But deep down, I already knew better. Summer in Georgia has a way of softening even the hardest hearts. The air turns thick with heat and honeysuckle, and time itself seems to slow down, stretching the days into something you can almost taste. By August, Eli had become as familiar to me as my own reflection. I told myself I was just being kind, that it felt good to talk to someone who listened without judgment. But late at night, when I closed my eyes, I could still feel the way he looked at me, steady, searching, almost reverent, like he was trying to memorize a secret I didn't know I had. One afternoon, the diner was quiet except for the hum of the ceiling fan and the slow rhythm of rain against the windows. Eli sat at the counter with his sketchbook, as usual. "Draw me," I said suddenly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He looked up, surprised, then smiled. "I thought you'd never ask." For an hour I went about my work, pretending not to care as his pencil moved across the paper. The sound of it, soft, deliberate, patient, felt intimate, like he was tracing the story of my life without ever touching me. When he finally turned the sketchbook around, I forgot how to breathe. He hadn't drawn me young or flawless. He'd drawn every line, every shadow, every trace of time that had shaped me. But somehow, in his eyes, it all looked beautiful. "You made me look kinder than I am," I said, my voice shaking. "No," he replied softly. "I drew you exactly as you are." I felt something inside me unravel then, a thread I'd been holding tight for years, maybe decades. It wasn't just that he saw me. It was that he saw the parts I thought were too old, too tired, too broken to matter anymore. That night, I drove home in silence, the sketch folded carefully in my purse like something fragile. I sat on the porch long after the sun went down, watching the lightning bugs rise from the grass, and I realized how long it had been since I'd wanted to be seen. Grief has a way of erasing you slowly, quietly, until you become part of the wallpaper of your own life. Eli somehow had made me remember I still existed. The next day, he didn't come in, nor the day after that. I told myself it didn't matter. He was probably busy, maybe working on his paintings, maybe visiting friends. But by the fourth day, I caught myself glancing at the door every time the bell rang, feeling that small, shameful sting of disappointment. He finally came back on the fifth day, his eyes tired, his sketchbook tucked under his arm. "You okay?" I asked as I poured his coffee. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Just been helping my mom. She's not doing too great." Something in his voice made me stop. "Is she sick?" He nodded. "She's been sick for a while, but she didn't want me to worry. She's all I've got, so I guess I worry anyway." I reached across the counter without thinking and touched his hand. "You're a good son, Eli." He looked at me for a long moment. "You sound like her when you say my name." It was a small thing to say, but it felt like a door quietly opening somewhere between us, a door that led to places we both knew we shouldn't go. That evening, after my shift, I found him still sitting in his truck outside the diner. The rain had started again, soft and steady. He rolled the window down, and for a second, neither of us spoke. The smell of wet earth and coffee drifted between us. "You want a ride home?" he asked. "I live 3 blocks away," I said with a half smile. "I know," he replied. "I just wanted to make sure you got there. I don't remember deciding to get in the truck. I just remember the quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a heartbeat between two people." We didn't talk much, just drove through the narrow streets until we reached my house. When he stopped the truck, the rain had faded to a whisper. I turned to thank him, and that's when he said it. "Claire, do you ever feel like you've been asleep for years, and someone finally woke you up?" My throat went dry. "Yes," I whispered. He smiled, sad and soft. "Me too." There was nothing else to say. I opened the door, stepped out into the damp night, and stood there for a long time as his headlights disappeared down the road. The rain clung to my skin, but I couldn't tell if it was water or tears. The next morning, I found a note slipped under the door of the diner. It was written on the back of a sketchbook page. "I'm heading back to school tomorrow," it said. "Thank you for giving me something real this summer. I'll never forget you." I stood there for a long time, holding that piece of paper like it was the last page of a chapter I hadn't realized I was living in. I should have felt relief. After all, whatever was growing between us could only have led to heartache. But instead, I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a silence that stretched deeper than I could name. That night, I took out the drawing he'd made of me and taped it to the inside of my closet door. Every morning after that, before heading to work, I'd glance at it, and every time I did, I'd whisper to myself, Don't forget you're still alive. Years passed after that summer. My sons grew up, the diner changed owners, and I got a little grayer, a little slower. I didn't see Eli again, not until one morning, 15 years later, when his name appeared on the front page of the Savannah Tribune. Local artist wins National Award for Portrait Series, Women Who Waited. There was a photo of him beside one of his paintings, a woman sitting by a window, her hands folded, her eyes distant, but filled with quiet strength. She looked almost familiar, and in the caption below it read, "Inspired by a woman who once poured him coffee every morning." I sat at my kitchen table and cried for a long time, not because I was sad, but because somewhere in the world, a young man who once saw beauty in me had carried that memory into his art, and through it, into forever. If you've been listening this far, maybe something in this story touched a place inside you, that quiet corner where old memories live. Maybe you've also loved someone you shouldn't have, or met a person who reminded you that your heart still knows how to beat. If that's you, I hope you'll stay with me here. This channel isn't just about stories. It's about people like you and me, finding light in places we thought were dark forever. So if you feel like this story found you for a reason, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I promise, I read every word like a letter from an old friend. And if you want to walk through more stories like this one, subscribe, not because you have to, but because you belong here. I hadn't spoken his name out loud in over a decade, not once. Life has a way of pushing the past into quiet corners, burying it under grocery lists and doctor appointments, and the steady rhythm of ordinary days. But that morning, when I saw Eli's face printed on that newspaper page, something in me came undone. I sat there at the kitchen table, the sunlight spilling through the window, turning the paper thin and glowing. His eyes were still the same, deep, clear blue, and that same quiet smile rested on his lips, like time had folded back on itself, and the boy from the diner was standing in front of me again. I thought about the last time I'd seen him, that night in the rain, the sketch in my purse, the way his words had clung to me like a promise. "I'll never forget you." I hadn't believed him. People say things like that all the time when they don't know what else to say. But he had kept his word in the only way that truly mattered. He had painted me into permanence. That afternoon, I called the gallery listed in the article. My hands trembled as I asked when the exhibition would be open to the public. The woman on the other end of the line spoke kindly. "It's open now, ma'am. You should come by. His work is something special." I hung up before I lost my nerve. It had been years since I'd driven outside my little town, but something inside me, a quiet, aching pull, told me I had to go. Savannah was only an hour away, yet it felt like I was crossing lifetimes. The city looked the same, the Spanish moss still hanging from the oaks, the air still heavy with salt and memory. When I walked into the gallery, the cool air hit me first, then the hush. The walls were lined with portraits of women, each one caught in a moment that felt both ordinary and sacred. A woman brushing her hair, another holding a baby, another standing by a kitchen window at dusk. They weren't glamorous, they were real. Then I saw her. The painting hung in the center of the room. It was large, easily 6 feet tall, and I knew her before I even saw the title. She sat at a counter, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, light streaming in from a window to her right. Her face, my face, was older than I remembered being, but unmistakably mine. The same tired kindness, the same faraway gaze. The plaque beneath it read, "The Woman Who Stayed." I couldn't move. I just stood there, tears burning my eyes, feeling every breath like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Around me, people murmured softly, admiring the work, unaware that the woman in the painting was standing just a few feet away, holding on to her heart with both hands. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice said behind me. "Are you all right?" I turned around, and there he was, older, taller, his hair a shade darker. But those eyes, they hadn't changed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The world seemed to stop spinning. "Eli," I whispered. He blinked, like hearing his name in my voice had taken him back too. "Claire," he said softly. We stood there, two ghosts meeting in the middle of a memory, both real and impossible at once. Finally, he smiled, that same gentle, careful smile, and said, "I hoped you'd come." I wanted to ask how he'd known, but the words wouldn't come. "You painted me," I said instead. He looked at the portrait, his expression unreadable. I painted what you gave me, he said. You don't know it, but that summer changed everything for me. You were the first person who ever saw me for who I wanted to be. I felt my throat tighten. And what did you want to be? Someone worth remembering. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, the years between us collapsing like waves retreating into the sea. Then he said quietly, "There's a cafe across the street. Will you have coffee with me?" I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because part of me was terrified. The heart remembers what the mind tries to forget. But before I could answer, he added, "Just coffee, nothing more." We sat by the window of that cafe, sunlight spilling through the glass, just like it used to at the diner all those years ago. For a while, we didn't talk. We didn't need to. The silence was familiar, safe even. Finally, I said, "You've done well for yourself. I'm proud of you." He smiled, stirring his coffee slowly. "You're the reason I kept going, Claire. When things got hard, I thought about you, about how you kept showing up every day, even when life gave you every reason not to." I shook my head. "You were just a boy." He looked up, and for a second, that boy was still there, but behind him stood a man who had lived. "I'm not anymore," he said softly. Something in his voice made me look away. The world outside the window blurred into color and light. I could feel the years pressing down between us, but also the pull, that same invisible thread that had never really broken. "Do you ever regret leaving?" I asked quietly. He took a long breath. "I regret not saying goodbye the right way, but I don't regret what we had. It made me who I am." I nodded, unable to speak. My hands trembled as I lifted my cup, and he noticed. Without a word, he reached across the table, resting his hand gently over mine. Not out of romance, but out of recognition. The kind you feel when someone once carried a piece of your soul and kept it safe all those years. After a long pause, he said, "I never meant to hurt you, Claire." "You didn't," I whispered. "You just reminded me I was still alive." We finished our coffee in silence, the kind that holds more truth than words ever could. When we stood to leave, he leaned in close and said, "There's another painting I haven't shown anyone yet. I was hoping you'd come to see it tomorrow." I promised I would, but deep down, something in me already knew. This was the beginning of another kind of goodbye. That night, I could barely sleep. My mind kept replaying every moment from the gallery. The way his voice sounded when he said my name, the warmth in his eyes when he saw me again, the touch of his hand over mine that seemed to thaw something long frozen. I had spent 15 years building walls around my memories of that summer, convincing myself it had been just a passing moment in a life full of harder truths. But now, every brick I'd laid was coming loose, and behind those walls, my heart was still beating for someone I wasn't supposed to love. The next morning, I drove back to Savannah early, before the heat settled in. The streets were quiet, bathed in soft golden light, the kind of morning that feels almost merciful. The gallery was closed to the public, but Eli had left my name with the front desk. When I walked in, he was already there, standing beside a covered canvas at the far end of the room. He looked different in the daylight. Older, yes, but also gentler, more settled. Time had softened the sharp edges of his youth without dulling the fire behind his eyes. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. I smiled faintly. "You should know by now. I always keep my promises." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded toward the canvas. "This one, it's different. I've never shown it to anyone before. It's the last piece in the series, but it's never felt finished, until now." He pulled the cloth away slowly, and my breath caught in my throat. The painting showed two figures, an older woman and a young man, standing on opposite sides of a wide river. The woman's reflection in the water shimmered like glass, and in that reflection, she was young again, her face full of light. The young man, standing across from her, was holding something in his hands, a small lantern glowing faintly in the dusk. "It's called The Distance Between Us," he said quietly. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The river shimmered with impossible detail. Every ripple felt alive. It was more than a painting. It was a confession. "You made it look like a dream," I whispered finally. He nodded. "That's what it was, wasn't it? A dream we both woke up from too soon." I took a step closer, my throat tightening. "Eli, why show me this now?" He hesitated. "Because it's time to finish it, and I couldn't do that without you." I didn't understand what he meant until he handed me a small brush. "I want you to sign it with me," he said. I stared at him, stunned. "Eli, I'm not an artist." He smiled softly. You're the reason this exists. You gave it life. You gave me life when I didn't know who I was. Just add your name. That's all I ask." My hand trembled as I took the brush. The moment it touched the canvas, something inside me broke open. All the years I'd spent pretending not to feel, not to remember, came rushing back. The laughter, the long silences, the way his eyes had once made me believe there was still more life ahead. My name came out small and shaky, tucked into the corner beneath his bold signature. But when I stepped back, the two names looked right together, different but connected, like they belonged to the same story. When I turned to face him, his eyes were wet. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" I asked. "For not forgetting me." "I never did," I said. "I just tried to." We stood there for a long moment, the air between us heavy with everything we didn't say. Then he spoke again, his voice low and trembling. "Claire, there's something else I need to tell you." I waited. "My mother passed away 2 months ago," he said. "She saw the early sketches of this painting before she died. She told me she knew who the woman was." My heart clenched. "What did she say?" "She said, 'That woman taught you how to see the world, Eli. She gave you something to carry when you were too young to understand what it was.' And she was right." He looked away then, his voice breaking slightly. "I thought about you when I held her hand at the end. I thought about how life gives us people we're not meant to keep, only to remind us how deep love can go." I wanted to reach for him, to take that pain and make it smaller somehow, but I knew better. There are things you can hold and things you can only honor from a distance. "She was proud of you," I said softly. "I can tell." He smiled through the tears. "So are you." I didn't deny it. "I am." We sat in silence after that, side by side on the bench in front of the painting, like two people visiting a shared memory. The sun shifted through the skylight, and for a brief, fleeting second, the light fell perfectly across the canvas, setting the painted lantern aglow. It felt like something divine, like the universe itself had paused to bless the moment. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I'm leaving for New York next week. There's a residency there, a big one. It's everything I've worked for. But before I go, I wanted to see you again, to say goodbye properly this time. Goodbye." The word echoed through me like a bell tolling somewhere deep and inevitable. "I'm glad you did," I said, forcing a smile. "You deserve everything that's coming to you, Eli. You always did." He looked at me with that same tenderness I remembered from years ago, the kind that didn't need to be returned to exist. "You'll come see me again someday, won't you?" "Maybe," I said softly, "if the road ever leads me there." He nodded slowly, as if he understood that life rarely gives us the luxury of another chance. When I left the gallery that day, the air outside was warm. The scent of the river carried on the breeze. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Some stories don't need an ending. They just need to be lived long enough to become part of who you are. And even as I drove away, I could feel it. The quiet knowing that no matter how many years passed, a piece of me would always be standing on that painted riverbank, watching the glow of his lantern fade into the dusk. 2 months passed after that goodbye, and for a while, I convinced myself that was the end of it. Life settled back into its old rhythm, the soft hum of morning coffee, the distant laughter of neighbors, the ordinary quiet that used to feel like peace. But now, peace felt empty. Every small thing seemed to carry his ghost. The way sunlight slanted through my kitchen window reminded me of that gallery skylight, and sometimes, when I passed the mirror in the hallway, I'd catch a glimpse of the woman he'd painted and feel her eyes on me again. Then one morning in early winter, a letter arrived. No one sends letters anymore, not really. But there it was, cream-colored paper, my name written in neat, careful handwriting I recognized instantly. My hands trembled as I tore it open. "Dear Claire, I made it to New York. It's louder, bigger, colder, but it's alive, and somehow I feel like I belong here. I've been painting every day, working on something new, something I've been afraid to touch until now. I don't know if I'll ever get it right, but you taught me that art isn't about getting it right. It's about feeling it fully. I think about you often, about that summer, about the diner, about the way you looked at the world when you thought no one was watching. That's the image that stays with me. I hope you're well. I hope you still find light in small things. Always, Eli." I sat at the table and read it again and again until the words blurred. It wasn't a love letter. Not really. It was something quieter, truer, The kind of message that doesn't ask for anything, only reminds you that you mattered to someone once. Over the following months, he wrote a few more times. Small updates, gentle words. Sometimes a sketch slipped between the pages. The shadow of a riverbank, a woman's hands folded on a table, a cup of coffee half finished. I never knew if he expected a reply, but I always wrote back. Simple things. News about my sons, the weather, the garden I'd started again after years of neglect. I never said I missed him, but somehow, I think he knew. Then, one spring morning, another letter came. This one different. The handwriting was unsteady, the ink smudged. Claire, I'm writing this from a hospital bed. Don't be scared. It's not as bad as it sounds. The doctors found something in my lungs. They say it's treatable, but I'm tired, Claire. I'm so tired. I keep thinking about that painting. The river, the lantern, the distance. I realize now that I was never painting goodbye. I was painting home. If you can, come see me. But if you can't, just know you're part of every color I've ever used. Eli. The paper slipped from my fingers. I didn't even remember standing up. Just the next moment I was at the phone, booking a flight I couldn't afford to a city I'd never been to. When I arrived at the hospital in Manhattan, the world felt too fast, too loud, but inside that quiet room on the 5th floor, time slowed again. He was thinner, paler, but his eyes, those same blue eyes, still held that steady warmth. Claire, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You came. Of course I came, I said, sitting beside him. You didn't think I'd let you face this alone, did you? He smiled faintly. You never did like letting me face things alone. We talked for hours, about nothing and everything, about the gallery, his work, the people he'd met. But mostly we talked about time, how strange it was, how it stretches and shrinks depending on who you're with. At one point, he reached for my hand. His was cold, but steady. You know, he said, people always think love is something that happens when everything is right. Same age, same place, same time. But I think love just happens, and the rest of the world tries to make sense of it afterward. I couldn't stop the tears. You always did see things I couldn't. He smiled again, weak but genuine. You taught me how. The nurse came in then, gentle but firm, telling me visiting hours were over. As I stood to leave, Eli whispered, There's one more thing I want to show you. In my studio. I promised I'd go the next day, but when I arrived the following morning, his bed was empty. The nurse's expression told me everything before she even spoke. He was gone. I don't remember walking out of the hospital. I just remember finding myself in his small apartment, the key still hidden where he'd said it would be, under a potted plant by the door. The place smelled faintly of turpentine and rain. Canvases leaned against the walls, unfinished, raw, alive. And in the center of the room stood one painting draped in white cloth. I pulled it away slowly, afraid of what I might find. It was me again. Not the younger version he'd once painted, not the woman at the diner. This was different. I was older, sitting on a porch at sunset, my face turned toward the light. Behind me, in the sky, faint and transparent, was the reflection of that river from his earlier work. The title at the bottom read, The Lantern Keeper. I fell to my knees. He had painted me as the keeper of the light he once carried, the one I had helped him find. And in that instant, I understood. He hadn't painted love to hold on to it. He had painted love to release it, to turn it into something that could outlive both of us. I stayed in that apartment for a long time, sitting in the stillness, letting grief and gratitude blend into something I didn't have a name for. When I finally left, I took nothing but a small envelope he'd left on the table. Inside was a note in his familiar handwriting. Don't forget, you were never the distance. You were the light. If you're still here with me, maybe this story reached the same quiet place it came from, the one where love and loss are woven together so tightly you can't tell them apart. I want you to know something. Every story told here is a mirror, and sometimes when we look into it, we find pieces of our own hearts staring back. If this one touched yours, talk to me in the comments. Tell me about someone who once changed you in a way the world could never understand. You don't have to give names, just your truth. And if you've ever been the keeper of someone's light, or if someone once kept yours, I hope you'll stay with us here. Subscribe if you want, but only if you feel seen. This space isn't just a channel. It's a home for stories that still echo. Grief is a strange companion. It doesn't knock before entering. It doesn't leave when you ask it to. It just moves in quietly, rearranging the furniture of your soul until nothing feels familiar anymore. For weeks after Eli's funeral, I lived in that quiet. His last words, "You were never the distance, you were the light," echoed through me like a hymn. I couldn't eat much. I couldn't sleep without seeing his face. But somewhere beneath all that sorrow was something else, something softer, like the first hint of dawn breaking through a long night. When I came home to Georgia, I brought one thing with me, the lantern keeper. I hung it in my living room, above the old brick fireplace. Every morning, I'd sit across from it with my coffee and talk to him like he was still listening. Sometimes I'd tell him about the weather, about the church ladies bringing casseroles, about my sons who still called once a week but never asked how I really was. Other times I'd say nothing at all. Just sit there, letting the silence between us do the talking. A few months later, a letter arrived from the gallery in New York. They were hosting a memorial exhibit, the final works of Eli Turner. They wanted to include the lantern keeper, his last completed piece, and asked if I'd be willing to loan it. My first instinct was to say no. That painting felt like the last piece of him I had left. But something in me whispered that it wasn't meant to stay hidden on my wall. It was meant to be seen the way he'd always intended. So I agreed. The following week, I found myself packing the canvas with more care than I'd ever given to anything before. When the truck came to pick it up, I stood on the porch and watched it disappear down the road, feeling both empty and proud. I didn't go to New York for the show. I couldn't. The thought of walking through those rooms again, hearing strangers admire what to me was a heartbeat on a canvas. It was too much. But the gallery sent photos afterward, people standing quietly before the lantern keeper, their faces soft, reflective, some even with tears in their eyes. It struck me then that Eli's light had found its way into them too. That night, I pulled out an old sketch pad I'd kept for grocery lists and idle doodles. I don't know what made me do it, but I started drawing. Not people, not places, but feelings. The shape of sorrow, the color of memory, the curve of something you can't name. The pencil moved like it had been waiting for me to remember what hands were made for. And when I finished that first sketch, I looked down and realized I had drawn a lantern, the same one from his painting, but this time it was glowing brighter. I laughed through tears. "You'd think you could paint better than me," I whispered to his memory. "But maybe I'm finally catching up." It became a habit. Every morning, I'd sit at that same table, sketching quietly as the sun climbed through the window. Some days, the lines came easy. Others, I just stared at the paper and let the pencil rest in my hand. But even in stillness, I could feel him there, not haunting me, but guiding me. It was like he had left a map, and each drawing was another step back toward life. By the end of the year, I had filled 3 sketchbooks. Not long after, a friend from town convinced me to show them at the local library. I hesitated. What would people think of a middle-aged woman picking up art for the first time? But I remembered what Eli said. Art isn't about getting it right. It's about feeling it fully. So I agreed. On the night of the small-town exhibit, a handful of neighbors wandered through the library's meeting room, pausing to study the sketches taped along the walls. Some smiled politely. Others lingered longer, quiet, thoughtful. One woman, a widow I barely knew, touched the drawing of the lantern and whispered, "It feels like hope." And I realized then that grief had changed shape. It wasn't the heavy, endless ache it used to be. It had become a kind of light I could share. A few weeks later, I got another letter, this time from a young art student in New York. She said she'd seen the lantern keeper at Eli's memorial and had been deeply moved by it. She had tracked down my name through the gallery and wrote, "Your portrait changed the way I see women in art." There was something in her face, strength and softness at once. Thank you for being his muse. His muse, the word used to make me flinch. It sounded too romantic, too fragile. But now, it felt right. Not because I had inspired him to love, but because we had inspired each other to live. That letter sparked something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. I started volunteering at the local community center, teaching art workshops for women who had lost someone or something they loved. At first, it was just drawing and coffee, small conversations, and quiet hands learning to move again. But little by little, laughter began to fill those afternoons. We weren't just making art, we were remembering ourselves. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the last student left, I sat alone at one of the tables, looking at the dozen half-finished sketches scattered across the room. Lanterns, hands, faces, all glowing in their own way. I smiled, realizing I wasn't alone anymore. The world hadn't taken Eli from me. It had given him back in pieces, in every woman who found her way back to light. That night, I walked home under a sky full of stars, thinking of the river he'd painted all those years ago. Maybe we all stand on different sides of it, holding our small lanterns, trying to see each other through the dark. Maybe that's what love really is. Not possession, not forever, but a shared promise to keep the light burning, even when the person who lit it is gone. When I reached my porch, I looked at the empty space above the fireplace where the lantern keeper had hung. It would return soon, the gallery said. But for the first time, the absence didn't feel like loss. It felt like space for something new to begin. And I realized I was ready to live again, to love again, not in the same way, but in a way that honored what had been. Because Eli hadn't just given me art, he had given me myself. It had been almost 2 years since Eli's passing, when I received the phone call that would change the quiet rhythm of my days once more. It was a woman from the New York Museum of Contemporary Art, her voice gentle but purposeful. She said they were planning a retrospective of Eli Turner's work, the largest yet, and that they wanted me to attend, not just as a guest, but as a speaker. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mind swirled with disbelief. Me, a middle-aged widow from Georgia, asked to stand before an audience of curators and critics and talk about an artist the world had begun to call the soul of American realism? The thought made my knees weak. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that." The woman hesitated, then replied, "Ms. Whitaker, you are the right person. You were his inspiration, his anchor. His work was never just about art. It was about what you two shared. The truth in that deserves to be heard." Her words stayed with me long after the call ended. For days, I went about my life pretending I hadn't heard them. But late at night, sitting across from the empty fireplace, I kept picturing Eli standing there, brush in hand, that gentle smile tugging at his lips, saying, "You can do this, Claire." So I said yes. When I arrived in New York weeks later, I felt the same nervous awe I had the first time I'd stepped into his gallery years ago. But this time, I wasn't a ghost haunting an old memory. I was part of the story being told. The museum was vast, its walls gleaming white beneath soft golden light. People filled the rooms, critics with notebooks, students with cameras, strangers speaking in quiet tones about the man whose art had touched their lives. And everywhere, his paintings hung like windows into his soul. There was the distance between us, glowing softly in its frame, and just beyond it, the lantern keeper, displayed in a room of its own. I stopped there, standing before the painting as the crowd drifted behind me. The image still carried that strange, eternal peace. Me, older, seated on the porch, my face turned toward the sunset. But what I noticed now was the reflection in the window behind the painted figure. If you looked closely, you could see the faint outline of a young man, barely there, like a memory caught in glass. I had never seen it before. Or maybe, I thought, I just hadn't been ready to. When the time came for my speech, I stepped onto the small stage at the center of the exhibit. The room fell quiet. Dozens of faces turned toward me, expectant, curious. My hands shook, but as I took a breath, I felt Eli's calm settle over me, the same calm he had always carried, even in silence. "I met Eli Turner 20 years ago," I began, my voice trembling at first. I wasn't anyone special. Just a woman working in a small-town diner, trying to keep life moving after losing too much too soon. But Eli, he had this way of seeing the world, not for what it was, but for what it could be. He didn't paint what he saw. He painted what he felt. The room stayed still. I continued. He was half my age, but sometimes I think his heart had already lived 100 years. We came from different worlds, different times in our lives, but we met in the same place, in the quiet in-between of loss and hope. He once told me that love doesn't wait for permission to exist, it just does. And maybe that's what he taught me most, that life is bigger than the rules we try to fit it into. I paused, feeling tears well up but refusing to let them fall. He taught me that being seen is one of the rarest gifts anyone can give you. And if you ever find someone who truly sees you, Not the version the world expects, but the person underneath. You don't forget them. Not ever. When I finished, there was silence. Not the cold kind, but the full kind. The kind that holds meaning. Then, one by one, people began to clap. Some were crying. Others just stood there, hands still, eyes soft. It wasn't applause for me. It was for him. Afterward, a young woman approached me. She couldn't have been older than 23. Her hair tied loosely behind her head, her eyes bright with the kind of hunger for life I remembered seeing in his once. "Ms. Whitaker?" she asked timidly. "I'm one of Eli's former students. I wanted to thank you. He used to tell us stories about someone who changed the way he saw art, someone who taught him that beauty isn't in perfection, but in truth. I never knew that person had a name." Her voice cracked slightly. "But now I do." I smiled, tears threatening again. "He taught me the same lesson," I said. "That truth is what makes anything beautiful." As she walked away, I looked around the gallery once more. For the first time, I didn't see the paintings as reminders of loss. I saw them as proof of what love can build when it refuses to disappear. That night, I returned to my hotel and stood by the window overlooking the city. The lights below glittered like hundreds of tiny lanterns scattered across the dark. And I thought of something Eli once said to me, long ago, in the glow of that Georgia dusk. "You don't even realize how much light you still give off." Now, finally, I understood what he meant. Light isn't something we lose when people leave. It's something they leave with us, something that stays. When I flew home the next morning, the sky was clear, the horizon painted in the same colors as his favorite palette: deep orange, soft blue, pale gold. I closed my eyes and whispered into the hum of the airplane, "Thank you, Eli, for seeing me, for teaching me to see." And in the quiet that followed, I could almost hear his voice again, faint but familiar, saying, "Keep painting, Claire. There's still more light in you." When I returned to Georgia, the air felt different, softer somehow, like the world had shifted into a slower rhythm just for me. The fields outside town were painted in gold, the first wildflowers of spring beginning to bloom, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was coming home to emptiness. I was coming home to memory, not the kind that haunts, but the kind that heals. The morning after I arrived, I unpacked my small suitcase and walked into the living room. The wall above the fireplace was still bare, waiting. A week later, the lantern keeper arrived by courier. I didn't open the crate right away. I let it sit there for a few days, wanting to give the moment the weight it deserved. On the fourth day, I pried it open carefully, and when the light hit the canvas again, it felt like breathing after holding your breath for too long. There she was, the woman he had painted me to be, not just seen, but understood. She looked back at me with quiet knowing, her face soft in the dusk, her lantern glowing. But this time, when I looked into her eyes, I realized something I hadn't seen before. The light she carried wasn't his anymore. It was mine. I hung the painting where it had always belonged and sat in the chair across from it, as I had so many mornings before. Outside, birds called to one another through the open window. The sound of life, simple and unremarkable, filled the room. I picked up my sketchbook and turned to a blank page. My hand didn't shake this time. The first line I drew was a small circle, a lantern, then a woman's hand holding it, strong and steady. But for the first time, I didn't draw myself alone. Across from her, I sketched a second figure, faint but present, his outline shaped by memory rather than flesh. They weren't reaching for each other anymore. They were both standing in the light. I smiled, feeling tears spill freely now, not from pain, but from gratitude. "You did it, Eli," I whispered. "You found the way." That evening, I walked down to the edge of the river that ran behind the town, a place I hadn't visited in years. The water glimmered under the fading light, mirroring the same shades he'd once painted: silver, blue, gold. I carried a small paper lantern with me, one I'd made with the women at the art workshop. Each of us had written something inside before sealing it. Mine said simply, "Thank you for seeing me." I knelt at the bank, set the lantern gently on the water, and watched it drift away. The current caught it quickly, pulling it toward the horizon until it was just a flicker, then a speck, then nothing. And yet, I didn't feel loss. I felt presence, a deep, quiet assurance that some lights don't go out when they fade. They just find new places to shine. As I stood there, a breeze stirred the tall grass around me. The air felt alive, almost whispering. I closed my eyes and could almost hear his voice again, that calm, steady warmth I'd memorized years ago. "Keep the light alive, Claire." "I will," I said softly, smiling into the wind. "I promise." When I walked back home that night, the stars were bright enough to see my path clearly, and for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't feel like a woman left behind. I felt like a woman still becoming. In the years that followed, my sketches turned into paintings, not perfect ones, just honest ones. I painted women sitting by windows, holding books, standing in fields, waiting for something unseen. I painted what it meant to endure, to love without needing to own, to remember without being trapped. And each time I signed my name, I wrote it the same way I had on that canvas in the gallery. Small, in the corner, next to his. Word spread slowly about the workshops. More women came, some grieving, some lost, some simply searching for a voice. I never thought of myself as a teacher, but maybe that's what love does. It teaches you, and then, quietly, it asks you to pass it on. On the anniversary of Eli's passing, I organized a small exhibit in the community hall, not for me, but for the women who had painted beside me over the years. We called it The Light We Keep. The room was full that night. I walked from painting to painting, each one glowing in its own way, and there, in the center of the room, was a small framed note I had copied in my handwriting, the one he had left for me. "You were never the distance, you were the light." People stopped to read it, and I watched as they smiled, some even crying quietly, holding hands. It was as if his words, his art, his heart, all of it, had traveled through time, through brush strokes and tears, through the fragile hands of strangers to find a home again. I stood there in the doorway, taking it all in, and for the first time, I felt peace. Not the kind that hides pain, but the kind that embraces it. Because love, real love, doesn't end. It changes shape. It becomes something you live with. A shadow, a light, a story. And mine had been a beautiful story. That night, when I came home, I sat by the fire and looked at the lantern keeper one last time before turning out the lights. "Good night, Eli," I said quietly. "You can rest now. The light's still here." And as I closed my eyes, I realized that maybe that's all any of us ever want. To know that when we're gone, the love we gave will keep shining somewhere, in someone, long after our own flame fades.